In the last video, we talked about some of the things that help the lung recoil to a smaller size, and that being the elastin within the lung tissue, as well as the surface tension generated by the water molecules that line the alveolus. But the question is, if these things draw the alveolus back to a smaller size, what actually stops them from collapsing? And so for that reason, we now need to introduce the concept of pulmonary surfactant. So to prevent the lungs from collapse, we need to overcome the effects of recoil and surface tension. So basically we need to stop the lungs from drawing in due to the elastin, and we need to somehow prevent the lungs from totally collapsing due to surface tension created by the water molecules that line the internal surface of the alveolus. How do we do this? Well, there are two ways this can be done. And the two factors that prevent lung collapse and expiration, we've already mentioned both of them to some extent. The first is called intrapleural pressure, and as you'll remember, the intrapleural pressure being the pressure between the two membranes that exist on the inside of the chest wall and the outside of the lung, was involved in the inspiration. But because our lung wants to reduce in size and our chest wall, as I told you, wants to expand, we can't fully collapse the lung simply because the intrapleural pressure was there. And you'll remember that when we had the pneumothorax, the lung did fully collapse simply because intrapleural pressure wasn't working. The really important thing that stops the lung from collapsing is something called pulmonary surfactant. So the pulmonary surfactant reduces the surface tension of the alveolar fluid by interfering with the hydrogen bonding that I told you existed between these water molecules. So pulmonary surfactant is secreted by type 2 alveolar epithelial cells. And here we've got a picture that I've taken myself on an electron microscope, which is a microscope with really high power, showing a type 2 cell with its lamellar bodies or organelles which produce the surfactant that's going to stop these water molecules from interacting. So surfactant or pulmonary surfactant produced by type 2 cells, and then it's released into the alveolar space. And when it's released, what it does is it lines up against the water layer because it's made up of hydrophobic tails and hydrophilic heads. Let's have a look at what that looks like. So say we've got our alveolus here with our type 1 and our type 2 cells. Here's our type 1 cells, on either side, and our little hairy looking microvilli covered type 2 cell. The type 2 cells produced surfactant, and the surfactant then wants to break up some of the bonds between the water molecules. So if we've got our water molecules sitting around the sides here like this, what the surfactant does is it kind of interferes with the bonds between them. And it does that because, as I said, it had a hydrophilic head, which will point down towards the water molecules, and the hydrophobic tails that point up. So we'll have something that looks a bit like this, surrounding the inside of the liquid lining. And what that does is then interferes with the bonding of those water molecules, decreasing the surface tension and preventing the lung from totally collapsing. So this is basically said here, surfactant reduces surface tension or the hydrogen bonding between the water molecules because it interferes with that attraction and thereby prevents the lung from collapsing down to that tiny state. So surfactant is important. It does prevent the lungs from collapsing at the end of each expiration, but it also reduces the energy required to start expansion of the lung again during a normal inspiratory cycle. So surfactant sounds great, but it also poses a problem because we only start to produce surfactant during late gestation. So right towards the end of pregnancy is when fetuses start to actually produce their own surfactant, and this has huge implications for preterm babies. So we can see here, babies often, if they're born before they're meant to, if they're born preterm or premature, they're not born at a time when they're yet producing enough surfactant. So premature infants often don't produce adequate surfactant. And because they don't have adequate surfactant, their lungs want to collapse after each expiration, and they're unable to keep their alveoli inflated between breaths. So basically the lungs collapse so much that the two surfaces of the alveoli stick together. And because they're stuck together, it requires an enormous effort to inflate the alveoli during the next ventilation. And this leads to something called respiratory distress syndrome, which can mean that the baby needs to be ventilated and on oxygen for up to 2 years after birth. Because of infant respiratory distress, that can cause alveolar rupture and lung damage. So what they try and do is they treat these babies when they're born with natural sprays of surfactant straight into their airways. and we'll talk more about this in class.